Good evening. And on the behalf of the Encounter, I welcome everyone, those here at the Metropolitan Pavilion, and those following us online. My name is Fiona Holly. I'm a librarian in Wichita, Kansas, and I will moderate this event. Before starting, I would like to warmly thank Somos for helping and supporting this event. Before presenting our speakers today, we will watch a short video about the man we will be hearing about during this event.
This is an amazing story. Father Kapaun has been called a shepherd in combat boots. His fellow soldiers who felt his grace and his mercy called him a saint, a blessing from God.
His example and his encouragement and this appeal to our Christian faith, I'm sure, saved a lot of lives. I know it helped me.
Emil and my grandfather were both born in Kansas. They were part of that greatest generation, surviving the Depression, joining the Army, and they embodied those heartland values of honesty and hard work, quiet heroes determined to do their part.
He was not what we used to call in the Army a holy Joe.
You know, he could talk to you like you and I are talking. That's just the way he was. He loved the enlisted men.
An American soldier who didn't fire a gun, but who wielded the mightiest weapon of all. A love for his brothers so pure that he was willing to die so that they might live.
To me, he is a saint already. I mean, in my mind, I pray to him like he's a saint.
In the camps that winter, deep in the valley, men could freeze to death in their sleep. Father Kapaun offered them his own clothes. They starved on tiny rations of millet and corn and birdseed. He somehow snuck past the guards, foraged in nearby fields, and returned with rice and potatoes.
Kapaun is sneaking about the prison camp at night, stealing food, ministering to the prisoners' spiritual needs, but also taking care of the sick, helping to bury the dead, a daily obligation and a very unpleasant one in sub-freezing temperatures.
At night, he slipped into huts to lead prisoners in prayer. One of them later said that with his very presence, he could, just for a moment, turn a mud hut into a cathedral.
We're sitting in this little mud hut that they put us in, and all of a sudden the door come open, and he come in, Father Kapaun.
He tried to raise our spirits, and he'd go from room to room in the evening and lead us in prayer. And Protestant and Jews and Catholics are all saying the rosary every night with Father Kapaun.
Looking back, one of them said that is what kept a lot of us alive. Yet for Father Kapaun, the horrific conditions took their toll.
Kapaun is still suffering from frostbite and seems to be developing a respiratory disease of some sort.
That's when the guards saw their chance to finally rid themselves of this priest and the hope he inspired. They came for him, and over the protests and tears of the men who loved him, the guards sent him to a death house, a hellhole with no food or water to be left to die. And yet, even then, his faith held firm. I'm going to where I've always wanted to go, he told his brothers. And when I get up there, I'll say a prayer for all of you.
The four of us are carrying him up to this death house. Of course, we're all in terrible shape. But Father Kapaun is blessing the Chinese as we're going up the hill. He knew he was going to his death. Nobody came out of there alive. And he said, "Bless them, O Lord, for they know not what they do."
2 days later, in that house of death, Father Kapaun breathed his last breath. His body was taken away, his grave unmarked, his remains unrecovered to this day.
Thinking about how he lost his life there for us guys, really. And you just don't get over it.
The war and the awful captivity would drag on for another 2 years. But these men held on, steeled by the memory and moral example of the man they called Father. Thousands of our prisoners of war finally came home, and among the homecomings, one stood out. A group of our POWs emerged carrying a large wooden crucifix, nearly 4 feet tall. They had spent months on it, secretly collecting firewood, carving it, the cross and the body, using radio wire for a crown of thorns. It was a tribute to their friend, their chaplain, their fellow prisoner, who had touched their souls and saved their lives, Father Emil Kapaun.
That was 2013, 8 years ago. Father Kapaun being awarded the Medal of Honor, 62 years after he died in that prison camp. Well, today, 70 years after he died in that prison camp, today, the U.S. Army announced that his remains have been located. He has been found.
Never in my life would have ever expected to get that call. Never. It's like I've told everybody, you know, if the Pope would have called and said, you know, we just declared him a saint, I'd have been like, yeah, cool, I like that. And then I'd have been less surprised.
To hear and learn that he was identified was an absolutely indescribable feeling.
He gave us our lives, but we couldn't give him his. We didn't stand up for him enough that day. We didn't.
Now I will introduce our speakers. Father Matthew Pawlikowski was born and raised in New Jersey. He graduated from West Point in 1986, was ordained a priest in 1997, and in 2000 re-entered active duty as an Army chaplain. In June 2015, he was assigned to West Point as the senior chaplain, the first Catholic to ever hold the position until he retired in 2020. He has also served since 2015 as chaplain to the Army football team. Beat Navy.
Hello.
Father Matt has been awarded the Legion of Merit Bronze Star is a senior parachutist, and is Ranger qualified. Roy Wenzl is a newspaper reporter, editor, photographer, and nonfiction writer who worked in newspapers for 45 years. He is the author of various books. With project partner Travis Hine, he won a regional Emmy Award in 2022 for the hour-long documentary Once Was Lost, about the 70-year search for Father Emil Kapaun's remains. In 1981, Roy was part of the news team at the Kansas City Star and Times that won a 1982 Pulitzer Prize coverage of the Hyatt Hotel skywalk collapse. Roy grew up on a farm in Washington County, Kansas, which his family still operates. I also need to make sure to mention Travis Hine, who very generously produced and edited the video we saw in the beginning, as well as recorded a short interview with Colonel Mike Dowe, which we'll see later in the presentation. Travis is an award-winning photographer, journalist, and filmmaker who works for the Wichita Eagle. As alluded to earlier, he and Roy worked together on covering Father Kapaun's story for the Wichita Eagle. On a personal note, I want to thank everyone involved in the preparation of this presentation, everyone for the time that they've sacrificed for this event, even traveling in the midst of various personal circumstances. So now we will begin with Father Matt's contribution.
Good. Well, Fiona, thank you. As a priest, I'm also an Army chaplain, which is kind of a call within a call, and within that, one of the vocations I feel in my life, like a secondary vocation, is to tell the story of Father Kapaun. So anytime I have an opportunity to talk about him, I'm always glad to do that. So I want to talk about basically Father Kapaun's influence on me, his impact on me personally, and then how that has turned out to be an impact on soldiers, and then not just soldiers, but then the wider view. So those will be that's kind of how I'll phrase it, okay? Me being an Army chaplain and then having a chaplain out there who's a Medal of Honor recipient and being proposed for recognition as a saint, well, the guy's my hero, obviously, right? So, I was saying back in the green room in the history, the United States military history, since the Civil War, there have been 5 chaplains that have won the Medal of Honor, and all 5 of them are Catholic priests, and I do like to point that out all the time. There's a sailor, there is a Marine, and there are 3 Army chaplains, and I've done some reading and some research on all of them. The only person, there's one that I really can't get good information on, Father Angelo Lightkey. But the other ones I know their stories fairly well. But there's 2 of them that are Medal of Honor recipients, Father Kapaun and Father Vince Capodanno, both Medal of Honor recipients, and both in the process for recognition as saints. But the Army guy is ahead. Just saying. So his story, Father's story, is he's just a great chaplain. I mean, all these guys were great chaplains. They loved their soldiers, and they were where their soldiers needed to be. And there are numerous instances of just their, I would say fearlessness, and that would be correct, but also always a calm as they were with the soldiers, that they were calm in very intense situations because they were doing what they were meant to do, what they were called to do, and they knew they were in God's hands. So they're all inspirational, and then Father Kapaun certainly. So even before his captivity, which is really how I know him the best, I got to know Father Kapaun through an article that was written by Mike Dowe, who you saw on the screen. We're going to see some more of him. But Mike met Father Kapaun in the prison camp, and that's where they became friends. That was the extent of their relationship on earth. They met in the prison camp, and they parted ways in the prison camp when Father died. But Mike wrote an article about that, and that's how I know him best. I also know him, thanks to the work of Roy Wenzl, who's done fantastic work in compiling all sorts of information. And Roy's book, The Miracle of Father Kapaun, is the single best source that I recommend to people if you really want to know his story, because he brings all sorts of things together. So Father just being a good priest, but having a real love for soldiers, and that's something of it's just something that God puts in your hearts. For all of us, we have particular calls from God. There's a million needs in the world, but for some of us, for whatever reason, there's certain needs that we see and burn within us, and those are the things that our passion moves us towards. So Father Kapaun certainly had that for soldiers. In fact, when he was in Korea, somebody asked him, "Father, here you are in the midst of combat and all this craziness. Like, you could be back home with your parish." He said, "Well, have you ever dealt with the Czech women's group on Sunday nights?" He just wanted to be he loved being with soldiers. So certainly his inspiration, his simple way of living out his priesthood and constantly being with his soldiers is just an inspiration. So that's his impact on me. I came across his story, I don't remember, 20 years ago or so. I was in a bookstore and I found just a little mimeographed copy of Mike Dowe's article and read it, and it brought me to tears. And then I shared it once or twice with some people reading the story, and it brought them to tears. In fact, it never fails to do that. And then just a little over 10 years ago, so I guess 13 years ago, is when I very deliberately decided to start sharing the story as often as I can. So that's when it started to influence a lot more soldiers in my life and became like a part of my own ministry to soldiers. So I want to talk a little bit about something called Ranger School. So in the Army, Ranger School is just a difficult school. And the purpose of Ranger School, you can describe it in different ways. One purpose is it has a very tactical purpose to teach people small unit tactics. So a squad is about 10 or 12 people, a platoon's about 40 people, a company's about 100 people, roughly. And so the school teaches people how to do tactical operations at that level. So it's that. But Ranger School also called itself a leadership school, and that's really how I think of it. That in Ranger School, they put people through very stressful situations, through lack of sleep, lack of food, lack of proper clothing, and very cold weather, very physical exhaustion from exercise and climbing mountains and whatnot. So they're very deliberately trying to generate stress in the students in Ranger School. And so once everybody's stressed out, you're stressed out, everybody in your squad is stressed out, they put you in charge and they say, here's a very difficult mission. Now you get all these other stressed out people to get this done, right? Ranger School describes itself as producing levels of stress that equal or exceed those levels of stress found in combat. Okay, so that's what the school is. And it's a leadership school in the sense of you really find out things about yourself. You find out you're far more capable of things than you ever knew. And that also means that you know that other people are capable of things that they don't know. As I read Father Kapaun's story, I've basically declared him the patron saint of Ranger School, because that's how it happens. I don't know if you know that. There's like no official statement from the Pope, this person's the official patron saint. Somebody just decides they're going to be the patron saint, and you start the devotion, and then it catches on. So Father's the patron saint of Ranger School because when you think of his experiences in a communist prison camp, in the coldest winter on record, where his experiences were being starved, being denied proper clothing, being denied proper medicine, physical beatings for sure, so physical exhaustion and other types of physical stress. And then, I mean, those are all things that he shares in common with Ranger School, but then his own experience of the stress of he could have been killed at any moment. He could watch his friends be killed. He was watching his friends die in front of him from the brutal treatment. I started to share Father's story just informally, one-on-one with soldiers. What did Father do in his prison camp? What was the real miracle of his sanctity in the camp? It was nothing supernatural, really. He would wake up early and get to work, loving his neighbor in very practical ways. He would feed the hungry. He would clothe the naked. People that had soiled themselves, he would clean them and clean their clothes and bring their clothes back to him. He would start a fire to warm them, but really to boil water so he could give drink to the thirsty and drink that wouldn't poison them with giardia and other parasites and bacteria that would get dysentery, which could then kill them. He would bury the dead, so the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy as well. He would encourage people and counsel people and pray for people and pray for the dead. So There was nothing that he did that anybody else could have done. But the fact is, he got up and he did it. And so his model of holiness was very simple and very human. It just required that he had to decide to do it every day. And so as guys would be going into Ranger School, or when I'd be talking to soldiers, I would point that out as an example of serve the people that you're in school with. When you're in this very stressful environment and you're being forced into to do very difficult things, and you're tired and exhausted and you simply don't want to, forget about yourself and serve those around you. That's what Father Kapaun did. And I know for a fact that does in fact work in this very difficult school. So that was Father Kapaun's impact on soldiers in a very practical way. Just his example of what he did would help people in these schools. And I still commend people to him all the time. People in my sphere, I try to tell his story as often as I can. There's plenty of times at West Point when I'm able to tell this story to some larger groups. And so I just try to have his life be an example to soldiers. So in that sense, that's his kind of impact on soldiers. But in a bigger sense, Father Kapaun's impact on the world in general, so not just people going to Ranger School, but our soldiers in the military, our service members, and quite frankly, those people who are soldiers in the army of Christ, which is all of you. Right? So Father Kapaun's story, how does it affect all of us, and how do I kind of bring that to other people? He lived in a communist prison camp, so aside from all the physical stresses that were placed upon him and the threat of death, there was also very deliberate things that the communists did, and it was a very conscious plan on their part. They very much wanted to isolate and separate soldiers from one another. They had rules that you could, if there were camp rules, they encouraged people to tell on each other. And some people did that. And whenever that happened, the people that had broken whatever rules there were, they weren't really punished, because that wasn't the goal of the communists. They really didn't care if somebody was breaking rules so they could go punish them. What they really wanted is they wanted people to think each other out. They wanted the soldiers divided from one another. And that was part of a communist world, to turn people against each other. You know, as a cadet at West Point, my field of study was Soviet studies, and the whole Marxist dialectic was basically class warfare, right? So for Marx, it was the working class versus the employers. But the modern forms of Marxism that are unleashed in the world now, and they're everywhere, and they're in our culture here in the United States, is to constantly turn groups against each other, black versus white, male versus female, who knows what. And so Father resisted that. In his work in the camp, he constantly went around and encouraged people to support each other, and to stay true to each other, and to not listen to the lies that the communists were telling them, and to not fall for their tricks and their ploys to separate them one from another. And so the interesting fact at the end of the war, when they started to get some statistics out of these prison camps, Father Kapaun's camp was really a group of all the soldiers that resisted the communist efforts. They stole food and they stole medicine and they didn't cooperate. And then there was another, and there was about 150 people. It wasn't a very, very large camp. But those were the people that sternly resisted everything the communists tried to do. There was another camp where the people did collaborate with the communists. They kind of cooperated, and they got more food and they got more medicine. And at the end of the war, when they did some studies on this, the death rate of the camp of those who collaborated with the communists was 10 times higher. They got more food, they got medicine, they got better treatment, and they died at 10 times the rate. And so in my mind, when I look at the world, and I've always looked at the world this way since I was a kid, the forces of communism are evil. They dismiss the individual, and it's really about the worship of the state. And so the state's all important. And so Father always looked in his service of people and taking care of people, he always saw the individual and the importance of them, and the importance of freedom, and how resisting lies and resisting evil keeps us alive. And so, especially in the last several years, there have been so many forces that have been unleashed upon us that have separated us the very quarantines of COVID, right? Prescinding from all the political questions, all that other stuff. The very fact that we were separated and in our houses by ourselves, the communists would have loved that. And there were rules, there were laws in New Jersey and in New York that if you saw somebody breaking a rule, report them to the police, and the communists would love that. So there's just so many things going on now in so many different ways. The reality of the virtual world that kind of separates us, and we think we're really connecting with each other, but we really aren't. So Father's idea of constantly calling people into real communion instead of communism, they're two different worlds. It's light and dark, it's good and evil. So a phrase that I picked up that I've developed when I talk about Father Kapaun, he gave me an idea that service is another word for love. That's his story in his camp, was he was constantly serving those around him. That was his expression of practical love for people. That was his expression of charity. His love brought out hope, and his hope kept people alive, and his hope was a light in the darkness. And that's why his communist captors hated him, right? They didn't hate him for political reasons. Maybe they did, and they didn't hate him just because he was a soldier, but they hated him because he was light, and his faith was shining through. So in the bigger sense, Father's story really reaches out to all of us, part of Christ's army, trying to stand up for what's good in the world, and whatever forces of darkness are going on now, and there are many of them, for us to just stand up against them in very simple, practical ways, trusting that Christ has us. So.
Thank you, Father Matt. And now, Roy.
Thank you, Fiona. So, my friend Tom Shine, an editor at the Wichita Eagle, first asked me to do a story profile on Chaplain Father Emil Kapaun in early 2009. I said, no. Dead 58 years, what was left to say? Give that rehash to a rookie reporter, I said. But Tom kept after me, as he does, and after 6 months, to make him stop talking to me about it, I made one single phone call to ask about Father. I talked with the priest in charge of Father's story for the local diocese, and that call was a stunner. Father Hotsey told me the Pentagon had recently resurrected the Medal of Honor investigation and that the Vatican had restarted its sainthood investigation. I still doubted. The Korean War ended in 1953, and so I thought that by now, 2009, surely all his soldier friends were dead or in dementia. But then I talked to 15 of them, battle-tested warriors from mass slaughters, survivors of torture and starvation in the Korean prison camp, and all were still carrying a torch for his medal chances, and all were still angry that the Army and the Vatican had failed to give him the Medal of Honor and declare him a saint. The soldiers allayed my other reason for reluctance. I was a lapsed Catholic who thought priests gave tame, predictable sermons, except for this one. While the rest of us suffer through worries and workdays, but Father's friends said that he saved hundreds of soldiers' lives, not just dozens, but hundreds, either dragging the wounded to safety through sniper fire or making cooking pots from scrap roof metal. They used his pots to boil snow. The Chinese didn't give them water, so they were eating snow to survive, and his pots boiled the water that held off dysentery in the prison camp. He picked lice off the sick. He got starving men to eat when many of them were committing suicide by starvation, which was very easy to do in that camp. He became a sort of Indiana Jones of combat chaplains, doing dazzling feats of heroism before he was finally murdered by his guards. He persuaded men to save each other, and these were traumatized men and boys who were refusing to follow orders from their officers. as they were starving, but they followed Father, who had no official authority over them. And so for 10 months in Korea, and in a lifetime of only 35 years, he was a dazzling success who still inspires thousands of people 73 years after his death. And I can tell you one other thing. What he did and how he did it and why it worked so well can serve as an easy-to-learn model for all of us today. Long before Korea, at age 25, he wrote a deceptively simple blueprint explaining how he would one day try to save the world. Anybody could follow this blueprint all the way to sainthood, even you and me. I described this successful person in contrast to the many failures of institutions we once trusted. Our Congress has become a circus where clowns far outnumber lions. Our military failed in Iraq, failed in Afghanistan, and before that failed in Vietnam, after which we failed our veterans. The Catholic Church has failed many people. Our middle class, meanwhile, has mostly disappeared, replaced by day workers who struggle even as billionaires get richer by the hour. Television news shows are mostly bad news and breathless at the 5:30 hour and are no more than smear campaigns into the evening. The smearing is even worse on social media, and it's you and me doing the smearing. And in families, people disown parents and children, uncles and siblings, based on whether someone in the family supports Donald Trump. These failures seem unsolvable. They tempt us to withdraw from civic life, from neighborhood relationships. They tempt us to balkanize our own families. Many of us have stopped contacting friends we supposedly loved for decades. I think Father could diffuse this and fix all of us sinners if only we could meet him. I know that he diffused me, a sinner. I'm a lapsed Catholic, but Father's story prompted me to overhaul how I dealt with people. I've tried to be like him in that way. I've tried to do for others. I tried to draw the best out of others, and I've tried to do this with a certain amount of calculation, like he did. So let me properly introduce you to the man and his blueprint. The first thing I'll tell is what he did, then I'll tell how he did it, then I'll tell why it worked. And that last part, why it worked, is the key to the soul of Father Kapaun and the key to how all of us can become successful and even beloved people in everyday life. His 8th Cavalry Regiment was the first U.S. Army unit sent into the war shortly after North Korea invaded the South. The chaplain and his mostly teenaged or early 20-something soldiers got into horrible firefights from the beginning, often outnumbered. And from the beginning, Father rescued wounded soldiers by running toward enemy snipers to drag wounded kids back to safety. Hundreds of soldiers saw him do this. One of them, Joe Ramirez, told me later that man was crazy. They fought for 3 months. On the march, he made himself beloved with hundreds of small acts. He preached a little, but only if asked, and did far more with wordless actions. He made it clear that he didn't care whether a soldier was a Catholic, an atheist, a Protestant, a Jew, or a Muslim. He helped tired soldiers dig foxholes and latrine holes, often without saying anything about prayer. He trotted off from the line of march into orchards and fields and came back with apples and corn cobs to pass out to half-starved soldiers. He helped wounded boys write their parents. He became indispensable. He became that guy they wanted beside them, the guy they wanted to please. As a result, young men did almost impossible things, though they were shell-shocked, exhausted, starving, and shivering in 40 below temperatures. The 8th Cavalry's 3rd Battalion was shot to pieces and overrun at the Battle of Unsan in November 1951. Kapaun refused to escape, and men saw him do that. In the battle, he saved 30 wounded men from execution by running straight at the Chinese soldiers, yelling at them to lower their rifles. Men saw him do this. And then on the march to the prison camp, the survivors, dead on their feet, stopped carrying their wounded comrades, who were then shot by the guards, probably to put them out of their misery. The exhausted GIs were refusing officers' orders to carry the wounded. But then Father began running up and down the line, and for him, they picked up the wounded. They did it for him because he was that guy who was always there for them, whether it was to dig a latrine beside them or whether it was reckless bravery on their behalf. In the prison camp, when the POWs, starving, began to steal food from each other, he gave away his own rations and urged them to feed each other. They saw him do this and stopped stealing. They saw him sneak out of the prison camp to steal food for them from either the guards or from neighboring farms, and they heard him lamenting about how theft was a sin and that he hoped the Lord would forgive him. They saw him repeatedly and loudly mock and denounce the camp officials when they tried to brainwash starving soldiers. One day, when the propaganda officers threatened the soldiers for defying the brainwashing, Father called out, "What a dumb son of a bitch." He said it loud so that the soldiers heard him say it. And so with that and many other things that he did, he turned hundreds of starving, shivering prisoners into United States Army combat soldiers again, with backbones like steel and hearts that burned pure. That's a summary of what he did. Now for how he did it. It became clear as I talked to the old guys that Father did what he did with a little bit of deliberate calculation. Actions with a minimum of preaching. Digging foxholes with them with only cheerful banter and a few jokes. Racing around battlefields, plugging wounds, giving last rites, asking terrified youngsters, "How you doing? Is there anything I can do to help you?" This was deliberate, it was calculated, and I believe that he patterned this behavior on the Jesus of the Gospels. Jesus did a fair amount of preaching back in the day, but he also healed sick people and sat beside sinners with a minimum of talk, actions over words. Father did this in Korea and won the hearts of terrified boys. They would do anything he asked. They knew, like Joe Ramirez, that that man was crazy, but they knew also that his heart burned pure. And now I'll tell you why this worked. I made this discovery in 2009 in researching him, and it's the strangest thing. It's contained in a sermon he wrote for the farmers and their wives and children who attended his masses in his tiny hometown of Pilsen, Kansas. There were only about 45 people in that town, then and now, by the way. He delivered the sermon on April 16, 1941, Palm Sunday that year. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs from that sermon now. It's Father's blueprint for his life and for yours. And as I read, I want you to remember that this was April 1941, and the United States wasn't even fighting World War II yet. And Father was only a 25-year-old priest, a farm kid, isolated out on the Kansas prairie. He had never been to war and had never traveled beyond his little farm town except to go to seminary. He'd seen the world mostly through books. He was at an age so young that many of you here today would consider him a child. And yet he wrote this blueprint for leadership in which he described exactly what he would do 9 years later when the world fell into disaster and he rallied hundreds of starving men to help him save it. As I read his words now, picture him running through gunfire with a soldier in his arms. See also how men see him do this. See him take dictation as he helps a wounded 19-year-old write a letter to his parents. See him give his own food away to stop the camp stealing. As you picture this, picture also all those hundreds of men watching him do these things, and then realize he planned the whole thing when he was an unknown, powerless, and insignificant young man. The first reading. Men find it easy to follow one who has endeared himself to them, he wrote. Second reading. A man finds it a pleasure to serve one who has saved his life. And lastly, third reading. A great leader exerts a most powerful influence over the hearts and minds of his followers, though the task of following such a leader is most arduous in itself, yet it becomes sweet and honorable and comparatively easy in practice when the followers consider the dignity of the leader, the relation of the leader to his followers, the motives which prompt the leader, and the rewards which he offers. Do you see? All his heroics, all his hole digging, and all the little battlefield hikes to grab apples and corn cobs for hungry soldiers, it was what it was. It was him helping others, but it was also calculated deliberately to win the hearts of desperate men so that he could then empower them to save themselves. One of his key insights was that while he wanted very much to save the world, he knew he could not do it alone. It's a simple blueprint, and not even original to Father. He lifted it straight from the Gospels that describe how Jesus operated back in the day. Think about him, learn more about him. There are books, there are documentaries, some of them have my name on them. You might think your world is hopeless, that you are powerless. Frustration might persuade you to give up, to cut yourself off from the cruel and silly world. You can't shut down the circus and Congress. You can't change the media. You can't tame the toxins brewing in your social media feeds. You can't persuade Uncle Zed to forego saying batshit crazy things at that next Thanksgiving dinner at your home. But even when our institutions fail, as they will always fail, even when the world seems hopeless, you can do what Father did. You can make yourself that indispensable soul who endears other people to you, one person at a time. You can make it a pleasure for people to know and trust and follow you. You can exert, as he said, a most powerful influence over the hearts and minds of those around you, even the strangers, even those with bad hearts. Institutions succeed at times, but they often hurt and ignore and marginalize people. But people, many times, succeed. They save and serve the world one person at a time. You can be that person who visits the lonely, a listener for those losing a loved one, the volunteer tutoring one lost child in an after-school program, even though it's at the end of the workday and you're tired. You can be there even for Uncle Zed. You can do this with such quiet relentlessness that all the people watching will know that your heart burns pure. Not all will follow your example, but some will go out relentlessly themselves to help or console or lift someone else just a little bit so that, like Father Kapaun, you won't have to do it all alone.
Thank you, Roy. And now we will watch a recording of an interview of Colonel Mike Dowe, recorded by Travis Hine earlier in February, which was recorded for the New York encounter. Colonel Mike Dowe is a graduate of West Point and served in the Korean War, where he was captured and held as a prisoner of war alongside Father Kapaun, who became a personal friend. He is also a nuclear physicist and resides in Houston, Texas.
I'm here in Houston, Texas with Mike Dowe on behalf of the New York Encounter. Colonel Dowe served in the Korean War, where he was captured in 1950 and held as a prisoner alongside his friend, Father Emil Kapaun. What image comes to mind when you think of Father Kapaun?
Well, I think of him as I've never seen him, but in pictures, as a priest in a cassock. But I also think of him as I saw him as a POW, where he had this beat-up stocking cap pulled over his head and a big old scraggly red beard and patch over his eye, looking like a pirate rather. He was exactly that. He was a close friend, and under those circumstances, where it's kind of life and death all the time, he became more than just an ordinary friend.
What do you think it was about him? Why did he go to the lengths he did to help and care for all of you POWs?
Well, first of all, I think by nature he seems to look for where he can contribute something to somebody who's really rather needy. And as the guys would tell about him in combat, he would go to the sound of the bullets. He would go to the trenches, to the foxholes where the men were under fire. In prison camp, he did the same thing. He would leave the officers' camp and go around the enlisted huts and tend to the most seriously wounded or those that are on the threshold of dying.
You've been a champion for him since the day you became a free man. Why is it that you've been so persistent in wanting to tell his story?
Well, as you started out the interview here, you asked me what kind of a friend he was, and so certainly I'm reacting to the fact that I had he was a very, very special friend, and you do things for friends, but more than that, much more than that, is there seemed to be a need for the kind of dedication and heroism that he shows among the youth that are studying American history, among the those going to the seminary, and in fact, even encouraging people to be priests, because vocations today are not as numerous as the church needs.
Is there anything else about Father Kapaun that you want to share with us?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. You couldn't have a better friend than Father Kapaun. He was not, as the way we've talked about him today. You think of tend to think of him as some sort of a pious priest figure. Wrong. He was not that. He was just an ordinary person. Was the way he would react to you, and was that kind of humanity that just drew people to him, because he just acted like everyone else was special, or as special as he was.
There are many things to be moved by in Father Kapaun's story. His bravery and heroism in the face of danger, his personal sacrifices to serve those who were suffering, even in the midst of his own. His sense of humor in the middle of the most unlaughable of circumstances, and they will say that he had a great sense of humor. And we can certainly praise these things for what they are, But the most significant for me in this journey of preparing this presentation is this hope that he brought to those around him. I'd like to read a quote from the Saturday Evening Post article from 1954, which Father Matt mentioned. It was written by Mike Dowe soon after his return home. He says, "But there was something in his voice and bearing that was different, a dignity, a composure, a serenity that radiated from him like a light. Wherever he stood was holy ground, and the spirit within him, a spirit of reverence and abiding faith, went out to the silent, listening men and gave them hope and courage and a sense of peace." End quote. This is a true exemplar of our theme as someone who knows me and inexplicably really cares for me. Father Kapaun had a hope in something eternal, and if you have a chance, you can look up, there's a recording on YouTube of one of his voice and from one of his sermons, and he preaches about heaven. That stood beyond the mud and stench, suffering and starvation. He was able to face all of that with confidence, with certainty. That certainty was contagious. It gave men hope for their own lives, and that hope is also for us. Please join me in thanking again our speakers and Somos that helped organize this event. There is also a table in the vendor area with books. So if you are interested in hearing more of his story, I highly recommend getting a book. Thank you.